What did the eyewitnesses, the ones that weren't the disciples of Jesus, have to say? What did the pagans and the non-believers say? What did historians and scholars say during and near the life of Jesus? Let's get into it. I concluded the last episode with some questions about extra-biblical accounts during, near, and after the life of Jesus. And what we'll do is we'll look at what a few of them are saying, and we'll write them down, we'll put them together, and we'll see what they say. Now I want to ask you something for a second, going back to the bank robbery. If there's a bank robbery occurring and you're a witness to it, say the robber comes in, he reaches across the counter and he says, "Give me all your money." And then I ask you later on what happened, and you say he came in, he reached across the counter and he said, "Give me all your money." Now, what kind of corroborative evidence could I find at the counter to confirm the eyewitness account? Fingerprints. I should find a palm print in the direction that the witness says the robber leaned. And if I found that palm print, that would be corroborative evidence of what the witness said in their eyewitness accounts. But would the palm print tell us anything about what the robber said? No. Would the palm print confirm that there was a gun? No. So it turns out corroborative evidence is always a fraction of the overall case. Now let's say, I interviewed the suspect a week later, and I say, "Dude, I know you're in the bank." And he says, "I wasn't in the bank." And I say, "I got videotape of you in the bank." And he says, "Okay, well, I was in the bank, but I wasn't doing a robbery." And I say, "Okay, I saw you walk over to the counter and write a demand note." And he goes, "Well, that wasn't a demand note, that was a deposit slip." "Okay, then you leaned over to the teller and you started yelling at her." And then he says, "Oh, well, I was upset, because I forgot my ID, and that's why I ran out of the bank." Now, has this guy confessed to doing a bank robbery? No. Am I going to use his statement in court? Yeah. Why? Because he's backed himself into a corner. He's admitted he's in the bank at the time of the robbery, doing everything the other witnesses said were part of the robbery. He wants to redescribe it, he wants to call it something else, but he's given me a lot of facts that I'm going to use against him. These are inadvertent statements that I'm going to use against him. Okay, I hope that makes sense. Something happens in the first century with these guys. They're not believers. They don't believe the Bible is true, but they back into certain claims that I'm going to list for you. Here's Thales, a historian writing in Greek, and he's trying to explain away what the early believers stated about the darkness at the point of crucifixion. This is quoted by Julius Africanus in 52 AD. And it says, "On the whole world there pressed the most fearful darkness," at the point of crucifixion, "and the rocks were rent by an earthquake, and many places in Judea and other districts were thrown down. This darkness Thales, in the third book of his history, calls, as appears to me without reason, an eclipse of the sun." So basically, if you continue reading this quote, he's talking about how a solar eclipse happened, or what he's trying to call a solar eclipse, although mathematically, because they could calculate these things, it was impossible for a solar eclipse to happen at that point, yet the whole earth was dark. The sun was hidden, like the testimonies in the New Testament. So here's a guy, he's not a Christian, who's saying that there's this darkness that occurred at the crucifixion. He claims it wasn't supernatural, even though it occurred at a time impossible for an eclipse. He says it has to be an eclipse of the sun. But in order to back into that statement, he has to give us certain facts that he believes are true. There's a guy named Jesus who lived and was crucified, and at his crucifixion, there was earthquake and darkness. But it's not for why you believers think it was, but he has to back into this claim. Okay, I'm not in the bank doing a bank robbery, or I'm in the bank, but I'm not doing a bank robbery. Okay, do you see what he's doing there? So we know this about Jesus, even if we had no other evidence from the statement of Thales. We would know Jesus lived, Jesus was crucified, there was an earthquake and darkness at his crucifixion. Tacitus does something similar. He's a historian who's not a Christian, who's talking about the destruction of Rome by Nero. And he says, this is Cornelius Tacitus, 56 to 120 AD, consequently, to get rid of the report, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty. What could that have been? He suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the head of one of our procreators, Pontius Pilate. And a most mischievous superstition, wonder what that was, thus checked for the moment, again broke out not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome, where all things hideous and shameful from every part of the world find their center and become popular. That kind of sounds like Washington, D.C. So the point is, he's going to offer some things that he thinks are true. He's not a Christian, he's not a believer, but he's confirmed certain facts. He's confirmed that Jesus was called Christ. He's confirmed that he was crucified under Pontius Pilate. His followers are persecuted. He's even confirmed something some might infer as the resurrection by saying, there's some kind of mischievous story out there. What could that be? This could very well be the very first non-believing account of the resurrection, at least being reported, and people were talking about this as early as 56 to 65 AD. Here's Mara bar Serapion, who's a Syrian philosopher writing to his sons about three philosophers or great teachers. He talks about Socrates, he talks about Pythagoras, and he talks about someone else. I'll quote it for you. Mara, son of Serapion, to my son Serapion, greetings. The key passage is as follows. What else can we say when the wise are forcibly dragged off by tyrants? Their wisdom is captured by insults, and their minds are oppressed without defense. What advantage did the Athenians gain from murdering Socrates? Famine and plague came upon them as punishment for their crime. What advantage did the men of Samos gain from burning Pythagoras? In a moment their land was covered with sand. What advantage did the Jews gain from executing their wise king? It was just after that their kingdom was abolished. God justly avenged these three wise men. The Athenians died of hunger, the Samians were overwhelmed by the sea, and the Jews, desolate and driven from their own kingdom, live in complete dispersion. But Socrates is not dead because of Plato. Neither is Pythagoras because of the statue of Juno. Nor is the wise king because of the new law he laid down. Historians place this letter around 73 AD. Here's a reference to Jesus. He's calling him the wise king. And apparently the Jews caused his death in some way. Phlegon, 80 to 140 AD, says this early on, quoted by Origen. Now Phlegon, in the 13th or 14th book, I think, of his Chronicles, not only ascribed to Jesus a knowledge of future events, but also testified that the result corresponded to his predictions. Jesus, while alive, was of no assistance to himself, but that he rose after death, and exhibited the marks of his punishment period, and showed how his hands had been pierced by nails. Now, ladies and gentlemen, these guys don't believe this is true. They're reporting what they're hearing from others. But here's my point. If you lost every piece of Christian literature ever written by anyone, and all you had were the remarks and reports of non-Christians or non-believers in the first 100 years, here's what you would know about Jesus. Jesus lived. Jesus was crucified. Earthquake and darkness at crucifixion. Jesus was called Christ. Jesus lived in Judea. Jesus crucified under Pontius Pilate. Jesus' followers were persecuted. Jesus was called the wise king. The Jews caused his death. Jesus foresaw the future. Jesus rose after death. and Jesus showed his injuries. Not bad, okay? This is called touch point corroboration, and that to me is very powerful. That's a lot of information, okay? So what we do is we test our eyewitnesses, and I think as much as they could be verified, the eyewitness accounts in the Bible are reliable. Now let me say this to you about that. If there were no miracle accounts in the Gospels, nobody would distrust them. No serious historian, no scholar. If Jesus was just a guy who came and preached the Sermon on the Mount and that's all he ever did, no serious historian would ever doubt the existence of or the validity of the Gospels. They are only doubted because they contain supernatural elements. No one doubts. You don't see the same doubt with Socrates or Plato or Epictetus or Aristotle or anyone else. They doubt Jesus. So let's do another test. How about this? Are they honest and accurate, or have they changed over time? How do we test this today? Here's a guy that was on Dateline and eventually caught and went to jail. This guy killed his wife in 1981, and he told everybody that she ran off. She ran off and she abandoned their small children, 5 and 8 years old. He said Carol just left, and everyone believed him. Even Carol's family believed him. They had no physical evidence because they believed him in 1981, so they took a missing persons report, and they didn't work it as a homicide until 1987. So 6 years went by when they finally decided this was a murder. They called the family and they said, hey, did Carol come home? Because clearly you would have called us if she never came home. And they said, no, she never came home. And the police were like, what? You never called us? They were shocked that the family actually believed that she ran off for 6 years, disappeared, no financial records, never shows up anywhere again, doesn't look for her children. She was gone. So fast forward, now we're in the 2000s. They opened the case. They had no physical evidence, not a single picture of the crime scene because, the people had moved and they never worked it as a homicide originally. It was just a missing persons case. Without a single piece of evidence, they convicted this guy in 4 hours. He confessed at sentencing, so we know he's the killer. And the reason why they convicted him is because he changed his story over time. He had one story in 1981, he had another one in 87, he had another one in 96, and he had one in 2012, one story in 2014 or 2014. You change your story over time, adding details that didn't exist prior. If you do that, you're probably lying to me. Have you guys noticed that your Gospels do not agree with one another? Have you noticed that? How many women run to the actual resurrection on the morning of the resurrection? Is it 1 or 2 or 3? Which is it? Well, it depends on the Gospel account. One says 1, one says 2, one says 3 or more. How many angels are waiting for them when they get there? 1 or 2. Which is it? Well, it depends on the Gospel account. Some say 1, some say 2. There's a sign over the crucifixion of Jesus, a simple sign with only a few words on it. There are 4 Gospel accounts that record the sign. Do any of the Gospel accounts agree? No, they do not. And you want me to believe that this is true? Your eyewitnesses don't even agree. Well, I'm here to tell you that just so you know, in real cases, witnesses never agree. Mr. Wallace, the book whose this video is based off of, has never had a case where eyewitnesses agree about everything, ever. And he's been doing it a very long time. He talks about one case where he got called out to a murder scene one night and it's raining and it's about an hour-long drive, and he asks the officers, are there any eyewitnesses? The officer says, yeah, I got 2 of them. They're both in the back of my car because it's raining. So he told the officer, separate them now. If witnesses are sitting together for a long period of time in the back of a car, is that good or bad? Bad. Because they have an hour or so to get their story together, and we don't want their stories together. He constantly has witnesses that have different backgrounds, and when they see the same event, they want to record it differently. Why would that be the case? How could there be this much variation between the 2 accounts? You don't say, well, this couldn't have been a robbery because the eyewitnesses don't agree. Your stories are different. Are you going to say, yeah, this person looks like like she was murdered, but I'm not going to. The cops aren't going to work it as a murder because all the eyewitness accounts are different. No, we don't even do that in real life today now. We figure out why they don't agree. It's our job to reconcile the eyewitness accounts, and they're not going to agree, okay? Everyone brings a certain background into it. They see things differently. So let me just tell you that so you can relax. In real eyewitness accounts, eyewitnesses never, ever, ever agree. And that's okay. That's a good thing. Because if they agree entirely, you shouldn't trust them. That's called collusion or fabrication. It means they've taken time to put their story together. And he has never had a case where all the eyewitness accounts were the same and where they all agree. It just doesn't happen, okay? He expects, and we expect, real eyewitness accounts to vary. That's not the problem. The question is, how do I know the accounts were written early? Because I think it was written early. How do I know it? How do I know it wasn't altered later? For example, Jesus was crucified 33 AD. The Council of Laodicea was, 350 years later. That's the real problem. Now, this happens all the time in trials. Here's a crime scene, and here's the courtroom. And now we'll put a piece of evidence in the middle, this bullet casing. Now, 30 years later, I'm going to bring this casing into trial. I'm going to tell you that there's an extractor pin mark on the casing that identifies it to the defendant's gun. The pin in his gun made the mark on the casing. That's going to be my case. But how do you know, you could rightly ask? How do you know that some detective didn't pull it out of evidence years later and etch the extractor pin mark on it and put it back into evidence so it looks like it matches the defendant's gun? And then how do I know the people that followed him had no idea that he did this? And they worked it like it was legitimate evidence. And by the time I get it and I bring it into trial, I have no idea that it's been badly altered. I think it's legitimate. Couldn't the same thing have happened to the Gospels? You have some Gospel accounts early, say John's, and we bring it into trial later, but how do I know that that's the same at the end as it was when it was written? How do I know that some scribe didn't cheat it? That didn't accidentally or intentionally make an alteration? That it didn't happen once, but maybe a number of times. I have 330 years for this to happen until finally the people who follow him are just like me and they have no idea that this has happened. Do you see the problem that we have here? How do we test this in criminal trials? Well, it's honestly not that hard. We ask a simple question. Is there anybody who took a picture of this thing? Anyone who recorded it? Maybe you wrote a report in which someone described what the casing looked like, and then he mentions the extractor pin mark. So if we have a guy back in the day who either took a picture or wrote a really comprehensive supplemental report describing it, that would be helpful. When he gives it to somebody later, like a detective, they would use that during the investigation to show the witness. So now we can see what he's saying, how he received it from the first officer. It's all well documented, and he writes his own report describing what he received from the first officer. And he'll eventually bring it to the crime lab, and they'll do all kinds of good work on this. They're writing about what they received from the detective, and then they're coming up with their own analysis of this thing, and then a prosecutor picks up all these reports with the evidence, and he'll write a report describing what he received from the crime lab, and he'll bring all this into trial. So now I have image after image and report after report after report over the years describing this casing. I'll know if it's changing because I'll see it in the reports. This is called chain of custody. In a trial, you have to show a chain of custody for every piece of evidence. Is there a chain of custody for the New Testament, though? Yes, there is. Here's the crime scene, the death of Jesus. Here's the actual courtroom, the council. The first officer at the scene is this guy named John. He's going to provide an account of Jesus called the Gospel of John. But how do I know what's in his account? Well, who are the next officers he's going to give it to? If you were wondering what John said about Jesus, you could simply ask his personal students, who we happen to have identified. His personal students were Ignatius, Polycarp, and Papias. These guys wrote about what John gave them in terms of information, and after John died, these guys became leaders in the local church, and they wrote letters to their congregation describing what they learned from John and the other eyewitnesses. Ignatius, for example, wrote 7 letters to local churches. They survived. Well, 7 of them survived. And in there, he describes much of the New Testament as he learned it from John. We don't have anything from Papias, unfortunately. Maybe we'll get some someday and we'll find something. But we do have one letter that survives, written to the church at Philippi from Polycarp. And in it, he quotes what he learned from John, and he's talking about many of the New Testament books. So if you didn't have John's work, you could at least see what it was John was teaching back in the day. You'd ask his students. Now, 2 of these guys had a student of their own. Ignatius and Polycarp had a student named Irenaeus. And Irenaeus became a really big leader in the church, and he wrote an apologist defending the faith, a ton of material. And this material he wrote survives to this day, even a list of books, 24 New Testament books that he was using with his students. Don't let anyone tell you that the canon of Scripture, the Bible, was created at some church council in the 4th century. That is not true. It's quoted immediately and listed hundreds of years before any church council. The councils don't create the canon. The councils simply confirm the canon that was in use for hundreds of years. Irenaeus had a student named Hippolytus who got into some trouble and was jailed and eventually dies in custody. So we can't find a student of Hippolytus, and our chain of custody of John stops here. Now you'll notice in terms of chain of custody, what matters more than the end of the chain is the beginning of the chain. That's where we're going to see if anything's changed over time. But there are other chains mentioned in this book in Cold Case Christianity. Here's a chain of custody from Paul through his 2 students, Linus and Clement, who he mentions in his letters. They became the first 2 bishops in Rome, and if you trace down their heel to toe, you can get all the way to Tatian. Here's the chain of custody from Peter through Mark, through the bishops of North Africa that he hand-selected at the school of Alexandria they planted. Pontius is the first headmaster, and his student, Clement, not Clement of Rome, this is Clement of Alexandria, and then to his student Origen, then to his student Populus, and then to his student Eusebius, and now we're into the council. So we have 3 different chains of custody in 3 different areas of the known world, none of whom could communicate easily or quickly. And so what do we learn from this? Well, if you didn't have the Gospels, if they weren't available to you, but you did have the first students of the Gospel authors, what would you know about Jesus? You'd be stuck with the kind of Jesus that Bart Ehrman denies. You'd be stuck with the same Jesus we have today. Born of a virgin, recognized as God, taught divinely, worked miracles, died on a cross, rose from the dead, ascended to heaven, reigns with God. The same Jesus the Bible talks about. Jesus does not change over time. The high Christology of Jesus starts early and never changes. Now, I want to share something with you that, for me, was a bit of a shock. It's the kind of thing Bart Ehrman says shocked him the most when he went to Moody. So I'm going to share it with you so that you won't be shocked if you hear it from somebody else. Why we're not teaching this in the church to our students is beyond me, but we need to. Do you realize that we do not have an original manuscript of any book of the New Testament? Did you know that? We don't have the original Gospel of Mark or Matthew or John or Luke or Acts or any of the original letters from Paul or any of the brothers or disciples of Jesus. We don't have them. As a matter of fact, not only do we not have the first copy of those letters, we don't have a copy of the copy of the copy of the copy of those letters. What we have are documents that are much newer. Okay? The most ancient surviving document we have are several centuries after the originals. Did you know that? It's important for you to realize that. So, how do you know for sure what's in the documents and what we have is true and accurate? Also, when you compare the most ancient documents we have, there are many thousands of variations between the documents. Did you know that? When Ehrman discovered this, he was out. And this is a ridiculous reason to be out, and I'll show you why here in a minute. But I wanted you to know that this is the case. So to show you what I'm talking about, I've assembled a few of these from the Gospel of John, because I want to show you what these variations look like. Here's one from one of the ancient manuscripts. This is the ESV version, and it says, "I am not going up to this feast, for my time has not fully come." But there's another ancient manuscript, and it's slightly different. Your Bibles are honest. All of these are footnoted in your Bibles. You've just been reading over them, and I did too. You haven't been looking to see what those footnotes say, but they tell you what manuscripts they use and why they chose the translations that they did. But here's another ancient version that's slightly different, and it says, "I am not yet going up to this feast." So one says, "I am not going up to this feast, for my time has not fully come." One says, "I am not yet going up to this feast." Now, it's not a big difference, but it is a difference, and it counts as one variant. The word "yet" has been added in one. Now, why would one Bible use the word "yet" and another one not use the word "yet"? Well, there's some ancient manuscripts that are translated a little bit differently. So your Bible, one translator might leave it out, one might leave it in, based off the ancient manuscripts that they're using. But maybe he's trying to deceive us. I don't know. Here's another one. One ancient version says, "How is it that this man has learning when he has never studied?" Yet another early ancient manuscript says, "How is it that this man knows his letters?" Fortunately for us, the expression "knows his letters" and "has learning" means the same thing. Okay, this guy's never been to school, yet he's educated. How can that be? That's what they're saying. But this is a variant. This also counts as a variant. Here's another one. One ancient copy says, "If anyone is to do God's will, he will know whether the teaching is from God or whether I'm speaking on my own authority." But another ancient version says, "His will." If anyone is to do his will instead of God's will, okay, means the same thing. And by the way, 99.9% of all the variants are just like this. They don't change. Even a skeptic like Bart Ehrman would agree that not a single doctrine about Jesus is changed by any of these variants. Not a single historical element is changed by any of these variants. In other words, you would not believe anything differently about Jesus, even if you didn't trust the variances. Okay, that's not what's at risk here. But if you look at the number of variants, this is why Bart Ehrman, in his book, he said that there are more variants among the manuscripts than there are words in the New Testament. Does that not sound rhetorically powerful? If you as a student, if you heard that for the first time in a Bible class at college or a history class, do you not think that would shake you? There are more variants between the ancient manuscripts than there are words in the ancient manuscripts. So how can you trust them? Because it doesn't matter how many variants there are, and I'll show you why. I have a son, okay? He boxes, he plays golf, he loves video games. He doesn't have a job. He's still school-aged, and sometimes he asks for money. He wants a new game or something, maybe to hang out with his friends. And I don't know about you, but sometimes I hate talk to text. It will make a mess of your messages. So my son asks if he can buy something, so I text him back. I'll get some cash tomorrow after I run some errands. I need to go to the store. I'll get $20. I'll give it to you when I get home from school. But Siri messes it up. So here's the text. I got a rash tomorrow after I run some errands. I need to go to the store. I'll get $20. I'll give it to you when you get home from school. What? There's some typos in there. I got to send him another one. I'll get some ash tomorrow after I run some errands. I need to go to the store. I'll get tiny dollars. I'll give it to you when I get home from school. Well, that's not right, so I'm going to text him again. I got to fix this. I will get some cats tomorrow after I run some errands. I need to go to the shore. I'll get 20 doll hairs. I will give it to you when you get home from school. Oh my gosh. Okay, now I'm saying I'll get some cats after I go to the shore, and I'll give them 20 doll hairs. So let's do one more. I should get this right this time. I will grit some cash tomorrow after I run some errands. I need to go to the store. I will get $20. I will grieve it to you after you get home from school. At this point, I'm ready to throw my phone, okay, but I don't. I control myself. Okay, so I'm frustrated, but I'm going to get this right. I will get some cash tomorrow after I run some errands. I need to go to the store. I'll get $20. I will gift it to you after you get home from school. Well, that's better, but now I'm saying I will gift it to him. So let me ask you a question. What am I getting my son? Cash. Where am I giving my son the money? My home. When am I giving my son the money? After school, when he gets home. What am I doing that day? Running errands. When am I getting the cash? While I'm out running errands. How much cash am I getting for my son? $20, right? But how can you know? You don't have a single inerrant text. As a matter of fact, if I was really committed to this, I could send him more. A lot more. I want to get it right. I'm going to send him thousands. Now I've sent him thousands of texts, none of which are inerrant, and now there are more variations between the text than there are words in each message. But you know what my original message was. Well, how do you know? Because you're comparing the texts to each other. It turns out, as long as you've got lots of copies, you can remove the error. Okay, does that make sense? This is a simplified example of the embarrassment of riches we have when it comes to manuscript evidence for the Bible. We have tens of thousands of manuscripts to compare to one another, and that's how we remove the error. So it doesn't matter how many variants we have. And there's a reason why your translator has chosen the word, or should I say, the group has chosen the word that they have, because they have done this process. So for example, if you're using the NIV or the ESV or whatever, and you want to know what they are using as manuscript evidence, is it some single document? No, okay? So write these down. Write quickly. Here's some of the documents we use to translate. This is some of them, but not all of them. So, when you have lots of manuscript evidence, you're comparing to one another, you're able to remove the variance. Okay? Last thing, what about bias? How do we know this is true? I mean, isn't it possible that these authors are so biased because they want to push this narrative? Okay? If you've ever worked in public safety, that you'll know, or you don't even have to work in public safety, you can just think about a situation like this. But for example, when you go to a drunk fight call where there are two guys fighting, or like a domestic violence call, one party always wants the other party to go to jail. What usually ends up happening is either neither party goes or both of them go. Why? Because they have a bias and you can't trust their testimony. Turns out all biases come down to motive. It's pretty simple actually, okay? When working homicide, he states in the book that he learned a long time ago there are only 3 motives to any murder. Only 3. You don't walk into a room, and go, oh my gosh, she's dead. There could be a million possible reasons why someone might have killed her. No, there aren't. There are only 3. Just find me somebody who fits one of those 3 motives and we're good to go. Okay? It turns out these are the same 3 motives behind any crime. These are the same 3 motives behind any sin you've ever committed. You've only committed a sin for one of these 3 reasons. Okay? There are no other reasons. And here they are. First one is pretty simple. I think you probably could figure this one out. Financial greed. Lots of stupidity has happened because of money. The second one is sexual lust or relational lust. Okay, appetites. Usually sexual lust for men, relational lust for women. And the third one is kind of harder to figure out because it's more broad. covers a lot of other areas, but it's power or the pursuit of power, pride and ego. For example, no one disrespects me in my neighborhood, blam, right? What's that? It's a pursuit of power issue. You've bruised someone's ego. These are the only three motives behind any wrongdoing. So if we're suggesting that the disciples were motivated to lie about what they saw with Jesus, it's only for one of these three reasons, because these are the only three reasons why anyone lies. Okay? So that makes it easy for us to assess. If you're saying the disciples were lying, then tell me, what were they gaining out of it in one of those three areas? Those are the only three areas. Are they getting paid? I mean, seriously, you think these guys were getting rich off of this? Getting a bunch of money out of this? I don't think so, and there's no evidence to support that claim. Are they getting laid out of this? Are they getting a lot of chicks? I don't think so. There's no evidence to support that either. They got despised. They got ridiculed. So maybe they're just trying to get powerful. I mean, after all, if you're the leader of a new movement, you got to have some power, right? Well, let's test that theory for a second. Paul, who wrote most of the New Testament, he starts off in a position of power. As a religious Jew, he's got enough power to draw papers to execute followers of Christ called Christians. He starts off in a position of power and authority, a pretty good position. And he decides one day, hang on, I'm going to jump in for the next 25 years with these crazy Christians or these crazy followers of the way. I'm going to get my butt kicked all over the known world, hoping someday to return to a position of power and authority. Really? Is that reasonable? It's not. I mean, it's possible, but it's not reasonable. Remember, if you're a disciple of Christ, especially a leader of the way, as they called it in the first century, you've got a target on your back. Okay? If you're one of these leaders, these guys suffered for what they believed in. In fact, let me list for you how some of these guys died. Peter was crucified upside down in Rome, 66 AD. Andrew was bound to death, 74 AD. James, son of Zebedee, was beheaded in Jerusalem in Acts 12. John was banished to the Isle of Patmos in 96 AD. Philip was crucified in Hierapolis, Phrygia, 52 AD. Bartholomew was beaten, crucified, then beheaded, 52 AD. Thomas was run through by a lance at Corhandal in East India, 52 AD. Matthew was slain by the sword in the city of Ethiopia, 60 AD. James, son of Alphaeus, was beaten to death in 60 AD. Thaddeus was shot to death by arrows in 72 AD. And Simon was crucified in Persia, 74 AD. So, are people willing to die for a lie? Yes. If they don't know that it's a lie, if they don't truly believe that it's a lie, they're flying planes into buildings, they're chopping people's heads off for something that they believe in because they don't know it's a lie. How much evidential weight do you think your desire to die for your beliefs carries? Zero. Especially for Christianity, it has zero evidence, or Islam or Buddhism or whatever. Your willingness to die for your religious belief has zero evidential weight because you weren't actually there to see what happened, to see if these things were true. But these guys, who actually would know if it's true, if they're willing to die for it, how much evidential weight do you think that that has? Huge, massive. There are 3 recorded witnesses to the golden plates of Mormonism. 3. The golden plates from which the Book of Mormon was translated. Oliver Calgary, David Whitmer, Martin Harris. Okay, those 3 guys. Martin Harris left Mormonism and was part of 6 other Christian denominations after Mormonism. If you're willing to walk away from your initial claim, good chances are it's not true. These folks, the disciples, they died for their beliefs, for their convictions. And what did they get out of it? They died without financial success. Majority of them died alone. All of them were persecuted for their beliefs. I'll finish with this. Some people say you can't trust the Gospels because they were written by disciples of Christ. You know, can you show me sources that aren't Christian? Well, I showed you some non-Christian sources today, but when someone says to you, you know, I need sources that aren't Christian, what they're really saying is, I can't trust the Christian sources. And I use the term Christian loosely because I am not a Christian anymore and I don't believe God wants Christians, but we'll talk about that later. I'm trying to give you reasons why you can trust the biblical sources, but this is a good claim and I want to cover it. I can't trust the Bible because, you know, they were written by Christians and Christians will lie about Jesus. I mean, they were friends of Jesus. Of course, they're going to say nice things about Jesus. Really? Well, let's test how stupid this is. Let's go back to the bank robber, okay? Like I described from the demand note robbery. You know, he comes in, he points a gun at the teller, he gives a demand note, the teller sees him, he puts the gun and the note back in his pocket, and from this point forward, it looks like a regular exchange, but it's actually a robbery in progress. This guy's pretty clever, okay? He did it very low key. No one even knew what he was doing, except when he walked in, he didn't notice that sitting behind the manager's desk is somebody that he went to high school with. And she recognized him immediately. And then she looked up and she saw her coworker and that he had this look on his face like, you know, push the button, I'm being robbed. We'll call her Jane. Jane was shocked. She knew that guy from school. I'm going to call the bank robber Bob. Now, do you think I can go to Jane? She's convinced that Bob is robbing the bank now. She's convinced that Bob is a bank robber. Can I go to Jane? Can she be trusted as an eyewitness? No, she can't be trusted. I mean, think about it. She's biased, right? She's biased against Bob. She thinks of him as a bank robber. You might even say she's a Bobbian. You can't ask Bobbians about Bob, right? Do you see how stupid this is? She didn't start off thinking he was a bank robber. She ended up there after watching him rob a bank. That's very different. She doesn't have some, you know, presupposed idea or presupposed bias. She comes to this conclusion on the basis of observation. That's very different. So she's a witness for us, and I think she's a great witness. She's qualified. But if she's qualified, why isn't someone like Matthew qualified? Why isn't Mark or Luke qualified? You know, Matthew, for example, didn't start off looking for the Messiah. He wasn't interested in the Messiah. He was a tax collector called Levi. He wasn't even called Matthew. Matthew was the name Jesus gave him. Okay? He wasn't a friend of the other disciples. He wasn't a disciple of John the Baptist. He was a tax collector. And Jesus came to him and said, dude, come follow me. And after 3 years of watching Jesus, he decides, I'm in. And he writes about what he saw. And you want to kick it to the curb because you think it's biased? He's not biased. He's convinced. There's a huge difference. We started off in the last video talking about this guy. Should we trust him? I don't think so. Now we're talking about this guy. Should we trust what we know, what we've learned in the scriptures and what they say about him? Well, it's going to come down to a cumulative case, the way we test any eyewitnesses. First, is it early enough to trust as eyewitness accounts? I think I've given you enough reason to believe that this is reliable and that it's early. That's a reasonable inference, right? Then we're going to ask the question, can it be verified? We didn't go through all of the information, but we went through a lot of it, and we've got more than enough touch point corroboration, more than we have on any ancient historical figure ever, period. Now we have to ask, was it transmitted accurately? Can we test this? Yes, we can. Chain of custody. This is a good inference. It's been transmitted correctly. And then finally, are these guys so biased that they can't be trusted? Well, if they are, it's only going to be in one of those 3 areas. So show me where. This is how you make cases. This is why it's called death by 1,000 paper cuts. This is why when you ask me to make a case for why I trust in the Bible, it's going to be tough to do in 5 minutes. It's going to be hard to put out in a tweet. You can't do it. This is how we make cumulative, circumstantial cases that point to one reasonable conclusion that these accounts are reliable. When someone asks me, you know, why are you a follower of Christ? Why are you a follower of the way? Why do you believe in the Bible? You know, I can't communicate that on Twitter. These last 3 videos took me weeks and weeks to put together to make 3 one-hour videos, and I didn't even cover all the information in these books. And there was no aha moment, no spiritual experience for me. What it was is I finally got to a point where I had no reason to not believe that it was true. And now I'm showing this to you. And if you believe the Bible is true, like I believe the Bible is true, then get ready, because I really believe you're going to lose your religion the same way I lost mine. I'm going to spend the next year plus explaining to you and showing you why religion, including Christianity, is useless. It doesn't work. Religion causes more harm than good. It has done some good, but it's outweighed by the bad, in my personal opinion. I believe the Bible is true, not because someone tricked me or because I was raised in it or my parents told it to me, because religion taught me so many wrong things. I know it's true because I did my research. I apply its principles and they work. An interesting point to that is that you can believe that something and not believe in something. Even the demons, even Satan, believe that the Bible is true, but they don't believe in the Bible. They're not in the kingdom. So then I thought to myself, wait a minute. If I can trust what the Bible is telling me about Jesus, I bet I can trust what it's telling me about me. And that wasn't pretty. I needed a lot of help. And I realized religion hadn't been working, and it doesn't work. And I began to get angry. Angry for being deceived, angry at myself for not doing my own homework, not studying this myself. Study to show yourself approved. But hopefully you will all now be able to defend what you believe, and your faith will increase. And, I work with some really great people, really good people, and some of them tell me, we're good people. We help people for a living. We don't hurt people. And if there is a heaven, and if there is a God, I'm sure we'll be there together. The problem is, no one is good. And we don't love a good God, we love a perfect God. And Jesus tells us, be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. That's a problem for us because we aren't perfect. But we can forever appropriate the perfectness of God through Jesus and get in right alignment with the kingdom. And we will be positionally perfect. Okay, that's righteousness. It's not a religious word. So now you have no good scientific or evidential reason to reject this message. And get ready. I promise you're not going to want to miss the next couple episodes, because we're going to learn about kings. We're going to learn about the kingdom and how it operates. See ya!